The letter fell twice before Maren Kessler managed to hold it steady enough to read. We regret to inform you the deed to the property, known as Larkspur Farm, will revert to the bank on the 15th of March should the remaining balance not be paid. She read it a third time in the barn, by lantern light, with her father's old coat still hanging on the nail where he'd left it the morning he didn't wake up. 14 days. She had $11 in a coffee tin and a cow that hadn't given milk since Christmas. She was 26 years old and had buried a mother, then a father, then most of the hope she'd been raised on. The town of Willow Bend had a way of looking at a woman alone on 60 acres like she was a problem waiting to be solved by marriage, and Maren had spent 3 years making it clear she wasn't interested in being solved. She didn't need a husband. She'd told the preacher's wife as much, and the mercantile owner, an old Mrs. Pruitt who ran the boarding house and liked to remind Maren that a woman her age ought to be thinking practically. Maren thought practically every single day. She thought about grain prices and fence posts, and whether the roof would hold through another winter. What she didn't think about was some man coming to fix what wasn't broken, only ill-fitted to the world's expectations. It was raining the night the stranger came, a hard November rain that turned the road to soup. She heard the horse before she saw him, and by the time she got the shotgun down from above the door, he was already at the porch steps, soaked through, leading a horse that limped on its front left. "I don't want trouble," he said, hands raised even though he hadn't reached for anything. "Horse threw shoe about 2 miles back, and I saw your light." "There's no in-between here in town," Maren said, "but there's no room here, either. I'm not asking for a room. I'm asking if there's a dry corner of that barn I could put my horse until morning." He had a voice like a man who'd learned to keep his words small so they wouldn't cost him anything. Water ran off the brim of his hat in a steady line. She should have sent him on. Every rule she'd built for herself said to send him on. But the horse was favoring its leg bad enough that she could see it shiver even in the dark, and Maren Kessler had never in her life been able to watch an animal suffer and do nothing about it. "Barn," she said, "not the house. And you're gone by first light." His name was Eli Cade, and he told her that much and little else. He'd come down from Montana. He said, though he said it the way a man says a word he's decided is close enough to the truth without being the truth. He didn't ask her name until she offered it, grudging. Over coffee she hadn't intended to make him, but made anyway because it felt wrong to let a soaked man sit shivering in her kitchen and say nothing. "Kessler," he repeated. "Any relation to Thomas Kessler?" "My father." Her voice caught on the word before she could stop it. "He passed in September." Something crossed Eli's face then, quick as a bird's shadow, gone before she could name it. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and it sounded like he meant more by it than the words alone carried, though she didn't press. She had learned not to press men who came through in the night. They rarely told the truth when pressed, only when they were ready, and by then they were usually gone anyway. He left before dawn like he said he would. She told herself she was relieved. He came back 4 days later, not to the house, to the fence line, where she was up to her elbows in cold mud, trying to reset a post that had rotted clean through, cursing in a way her mother would have slapped her for. "You're doing that wrong," he said from behind her, and she nearly put the post maul through her own boot from the surprise of it. "I didn't ask for company." "No," he agreed, "but you asked for that post to stand up straight, and it won't. Not set like that." He crouched down, studied the hole, studied her, and something in his manner suggested he wasn't trying to prove a point so much as he genuinely could not watch bad work happen in front of him without saying something. I can manage my own farm, Mr. Cade. Never said you couldn't. Said you were setting that post wrong." He looked up at her, and there was no smirk in it, no man's satisfaction at catching a woman out. Just plain fact offered plain. "I'll be gone in 20 minutes. Won't cost you a thing but the 20 minutes. She let him because her arms ached and because some contrary, tired part of her wanted to see if he actually knew what he claimed to know. He did. The post went in solid, tamped tight, standing straighter than any she'd managed alone in a week of trying. "Where'd you learn fencing?" she asked, not quite a question, more a demand dressed as one. "Different places." He wiped his hands on his trousers. "I've done a lot of different work." "That's not an answer." "No," he said again, and this time there was something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. It isn't. He stayed in Willow Bend, took a room above the feed store, did odd work for anyone willing to pay a few coins for a strong back and steady hands, and somehow, without either of them quite agreeing to it, kept ending up on Larkspur Farm 2 or 3 days a week. He fixed the chicken coop. He looked at the cow that wasn't giving milk and diagnosed a foot problem Maren hadn't thought to check, and within a week the cow was giving milk again. He never asked for payment beyond a meal, and he never stayed past supper, and he never once mentioned the deed or the bank or the $11 in the coffee tin, because she'd never told him, because it wasn't his business, and she wasn't in the habit of handing her troubles to men who drifted through in the rain. But Mrs. Pruitt had no such reservations about other people's business, and it was from her at the mercantile, over a sack of flour Maren couldn't quite afford, that Maren learned the bank in question was run by a man named Whitfield Ross, and that Whitfield Ross had been asking around town about the Kessler place with what Mrs. Pruitt called a particular kind of interest. "He wants it for himself," Mrs. Pruitt said, lowering her voice like the words were valuable. "Wants that whole stretch along the creek for a mill. Been saying so at the bank for months. Only he can't buy what ain't for sale, and your daddy always said no. Now your daddy's gone, and the debt's coming due, and, well..." She let the sentence hang there, heavy with what she wasn't quite saying. Maren walked home with the flour under her arm and a coldness in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. 11 days left. She did the arithmetic of her life over and over that night, and it came out the same every time. She would lose the farm, and Whitfield Ross would get exactly what he wanted, and there was nothing in her power to stop either. She didn't tell Eli. She told herself it was because he wasn't owed her troubles. The truth, if she'd let herself look at it, was closer to shame. The particular shame of a woman who'd spent 3 years insisting she needed nothing from anyone, about to prove herself wrong in the worst possible way. He found out anyway. He always seemed to. He was mending the porch rail on a cold, bright afternoon when he asked, without looking up from his work, "When's the payment due, Maren?" She went still. "How do you know about that?" "Man at the bank talks when he's had a drink. Whitfield Ross has been talking a great deal." Eli set down his hammer. 15th of March. "That's what I heard. It's not your concern. I didn't say it was." He stood, faced her, and there was something raw in his expression now, something he'd been keeping folded away same as she had. "I said I heard. That's different from saying I'll walk off and pretend I didn't." "What would you have me do, Eli?" "Marry money I don't have out of thin air." The words came out sharper than she meant, 3 years of pride cracking at the edges. "I don't need rescuing. I've managed. I'll manage. I never once thought you needed rescuing." His voice dropped, quiet and certain. "I've watched you set fence posts and doctor a sick cow and run this whole place near single-handed since her daddy died, and there's not one thing about you that says needs rescuing. But there's a difference between needing help and refusing it out of pride, and I think you know that difference better than you're letting on." She wanted to be angry at him for it. She found, standing there in the cold with her breath fogging between them, that she wasn't. She was tired, tired down to the bone, the way she hadn't let herself be since the funeral, because there'd been no one to be tired in front of. "I don't have the money," she said finally, and it was the first time she'd said the truth of it out loud to another living soul. $11 in a coffee tin and a debt of $400. "I don't know what I'm going to do, Eli. I've turned it over every night for 2 weeks, and I don't know." He didn't touch her. She noticed that later, turned it over in her mind. How he'd stood close enough to matter and hadn't reached for her, had let her have the confession without trying to collect anything for it. "Then we figure something," he said. "Not you alone. We. There is no we. You're a man who fixes fences for supper. You don't owe this farm anything. Maybe not the farm." His jaw tightened. "But I owe your father something, and I've been a coward about saying so, and I think it's time I stopped." That stopped her cold. "What do you mean, you owe my father?" He was quiet a long moment, long enough that the wind picked up and rattled the bare branches of the elm by the porch. "Your father loaned me money once, years back, when I was young and fool enough to gamble away everything I had in a card game in Cheyenne. $50, no note, no interest, just handed it over and told me to make something of myself instead of drinking myself into a ditch. I never paid him back. Told myself I would someday when I had it to spare, and someday kept sliding further off the way it does. When I heard he'd passed, I came here meaning to find his grave and leave the money on it, which I know is a fool's gesture, but it was the only one I had left to make. His voice roughened. That's the truth of why I came in the rain that night. Not chance. I've been circling this town for 2 days working up the nerve. Maren stared at him, the pieces of 3 years' worth of quiet loneliness rearranging themselves into something she hadn't expected. You've been here a month, she said slowly, mending my fences and doctoring my cow, and you never said. I kept meaning to. Then I kept finding reasons to stay another day instead, and the longer I stayed, the harder it got to explain why I hadn't said on the first one. He looked at her, and there was no more folding away in his face now. I'm not a rich man, Maren. I've got maybe $60 saved from work these last years, and it isn't near enough to save this farm. But it's yours, every cent, because it was your father's kindness that let me have a life worth saving in the first place. I should have given it to him. I'll give it to his daughter instead, and it still won't be enough, but I couldn't stand here another day letting you carry this alone when I had even that much to offer. She had to sit down on the porch step. Not from the money. $60 against $400 was a drop against a flood, but from the plain fact of a man who'd walked around for a month with a confession folded up in his chest, waiting for courage instead of convenience. Whitfield Ross wants this land, she said finally, half to herself. Wants it bad enough, he's probably already told the bank not to entertain any late payment, any extension, anything that isn't the property falling straight into his hands. Then we don't ask the bank, Eli said. We ask the town. She laughed, short and without much joy in it. The town doesn't have $400 to spare on my behalf. The town has more than you'd think if it's asked the right way. He crouched down in front of her, elbows on his knees, and something in his face had gone bright and stubborn, a man building a plan out of scraps. Your father sold seed to half the farms in this valley on credit when their own crops failed, didn't he? Carried them through the drought 2 years back. He did. She hadn't thought of it in months, but it was true. Thomas Kessler had never turned away a neighbor short on cash, had let debts run a season or two longer than any banker would allow, because he remembered what it was to need mercy himself once. Then those farms owe him, whether the debt's on paper or not. Might be time somebody reminded them. It took 8 days. 8 days of Eli riding to every farm within 10 miles, and Maren swallowing 3 years of pride whole, going door to door herself to the families her father had helped, not asking for charity, but for repayment of a debt of kindness that had never been written down, but had never been forgotten either. Some doors shut quiet and apologetic, families with nothing to spare of their own, but more open wide than she expected. The Hallorans, who'd lost their whole wheat crop to hail in '82 and had eaten through the winter on Thomas Kessler's seed and patience, gave $30 without being asked twice. Old man Denny, who'd never had a kind word for anyone in his life, pressed a crumpled 20 in her hand and said only, "Your daddy didn't have to wait on my payment. I don't have to wait on this." Word got to Whitfield Ross before the 15th, the way word always does in a town small enough to fit its gossip in one mercantile. He came to Larkspur Farm himself on the 14th, in a coat too fine for the mud he tracked across her porch, and told her plainly that whatever she'd scraped together, it wouldn't be enough, and she'd save herself the humiliation of a public foreclosure by simply signing the papers now. "I'll take my chances at the bank tomorrow morning, Mr. Ross," she said, standing straight in her own doorway, Eli a silent, solid presence at her shoulder, in front of whoever cares to watch. "There won't be anything to watch," Ross said, "except a woman losing what she couldn't hold on to. Then you won't mind being there to see it fail to happen," Eli said, mild as anything, and something in his tone made Ross's eyes flick to him with a wariness that hadn't been there a moment before. The bank was full the next morning, fuller than Maren had ever seen it. Farmers and their wives crowded along the walls, coats dripping snow melt onto the floor, because word had traveled and half the valley had decided this was worth witnessing. Maren stood at the counter with a cloth sack of coins and bills that had been counted 3 times over at her kitchen table the night before, Eli beside her, and set the whole $412 down in front of the bank manager, while Whitfield Ross watched from the back of the room, with his jaw set hard enough to crack. $412, the bank manager said, counting it slow, plainly enjoying every second of Ross's silence. That satisfies the debt in full, Miss Kessler. The deed's yours clear. The room let out its breath all at once, a low murmur of satisfaction, and somebody, she thought it was Mrs. Halloran, actually clapped, and Maren stood there with her eyes stinging, not from the cold anymore. Outside, in the thin winter sunlight, Ross caught up to her on the steps, his composure slipping into something uglier. "You think this is over? I'll find another way to that creek frontage." "Maybe you will," Maren said, and she was surprised at how steady her own voice came out. "But not through me, and not through fear, Mr. Ross. My father built a life on this valley by giving people room to breathe. I mean to keep doing the same, and you'll find there's not much room left in it for a man who only knows how to take." He had nothing to say to that. He walked off toward his fine carriage with his fine coat and none of what he'd come for, and Maren stood on the bank steps in the cold with the whole valley around her, and felt for the first time since her father died that the ground beneath her was actually solid. Eli found her there a moment later, hat in hand. "You did that," he said. "Every bit of it. I just carried some letters and knocked on some doors." "You carried more than that." She looked at him, this man who'd come to her in the rain, meaning only to leave money on a dead man's grave, and had instead stayed to help his daughter keep the whole of what that man had built. "You could have left the money and gone. Nobody would have known different." "I'd have known." He turned his hat in his hands, suddenly less certain than she'd seen him in weeks. "Truth is, Maren, I wasn't only staying on account of the debt. Not for a while now. I kept finding reasons because I wanted the reasons, and I didn't know how to say that without it sounding like I was asking for something you never agreed to want." "And what is it you're asking?" "Nothing you haven't got a right to refuse." He met her eyes, plain and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before. I don't need a home, Maren. I've gone without one long enough to stop missing it. But I found myself wanting one anyway, since I came up your road in the rain, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't on account of you." She thought of 3 years of telling the whole town she needed no man, no rescue, no hand extended toward her that she hadn't asked for. She thought of how none of that pride had kept the roof sound or the debt paid, how it had taken a stranger's honesty and a valley's memory of her father's kindness to save what she loved, and how neither of those things had cost her the independence she'd guarded so fiercely. They'd only prove she didn't have to guard it alone to keep it. "I don't need a husband," she said, and watched something flicker in his face before she went on, gentler. "But I find I might want one anyway. If he's the kind who sets a fence post honest and tells the truth even when it costs him." The smile that broke over his face then was nothing like the careful, folded-away thing she'd first seen in her kitchen weeks ago. It was wide open, unguarded, the smile of a man who had come looking for a grave to make peace with and found instead a whole life waiting on the other side of that peace. They were married in May, in the yard at Larkspur Farm, under the elm tree that had rattled bare the night. He confessed his debt, now full of new green leaves and the sound of bees working the clover. Half the valley came. The Hallorans brought a cake. Old man Denny, gruff as ever, allowed that it was a fine thing, and didn't say much more than that, but he stayed till the last lantern was lit, which from him was as good as a blessing. Years later, when their own children asked how their mother and father had met, Maren would tell it simple. A stranger came up the road in the rain with a debt he meant to pay to a dead man, and stayed instead to help pay a debt neither of them had known was owed. One of kindness, passed down and multiplied, from a father who never turned a neighbor away, to a daughter who learned, at last, that letting someone stand beside you is not the same as needing to be carried.